The morning air outside the music hall was cold and sharp. The sun had barely risen, but a long line of young performers had already gathered near the front doors, clutching their folders, instruments, and dreams. Among them stood a quiet girl with a small bag slung over her shoulder and a worn piece of paper in her hand. Her clothes were plain and her shoes had lost their shine. Still, her eyes carried something that didn't match her simple appearance, a calm determination. It was audition day at the city's most prestigious performing arts school, the place where the country's best young musicians came to prove their worth. The girl had traveled all night on a bus from her small hometown, holding on to one thing: hope. When the doors opened, a rush of nervous chatter filled the hallways. People laughed, tuned instruments, or practiced their pieces on imaginary keyboards. The girl found a quiet corner near the back, sat down, and carefully opened her folder. Inside were handwritten notes, some of them faded from time. The staff at the registration desk looked at her curiously. She smiled shyly and handed over her papers. "Piano audition?" one of them asked. "Yes," she said softly. The woman gave her a quick look, noticing the outdated form and the lack of formal training listed. Most of the other applicants had attended music academies or private lessons. This girl's form simply said self-taught. "You can wait in Hall B," the woman said, a hint of doubt in her voice. The girl nodded and quietly made her way down the hall. Her heart was pounding, but she tried to keep her hands steady. The sound of pianos echoed from every direction, fast, complex, professional. She could hear the other students practicing classical pieces by famous composers, their fingers flying across the keys. She didn't play like that. Her music came from somewhere else, from feelings, from memories, from the nights when she would sit beside a broken keyboard and imagine herself performing in front of a crowd that listened with their hearts, not their eyes. When it was her turn, she stepped into the large auditorium. The stage lights were bright, and in the front row sat the judging panel, 3 people who looked serious and focused. In the middle sat the director, a man known for his strict standards. He was famous for discovering great talent, but also for his harsh criticism. The girl walked slowly toward the piano. She bowed politely, then waited for a sign. The director scanned her form, then raised his head with a faint smirk. "You're here to play the piano?" he asked, his tone half amused, half doubtful. "Yes, sir," she answered quietly. He looked at her clothes again, then back at the paper. "It says here you've never studied formally. No music school, no instructor?" She shook her head. "No, sir. I learned on my own." A few students sitting at the back of the hall whispered and exchanged smiles. The director sighed. "All right then," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Let's hear it. But keep it short, please. We have a lot of applicants today." The girl nodded. She walked to the grand piano, ran her fingers gently over the keys, and took a slow breath. For a moment, the hall felt too big for her small frame. Her heart was racing, and the faint sound of laughter from the back made her chest tighten. But then she remembered why she was there. She remembered the nights when she would stay awake, listening to her mother hum lullabies after a long day of work. She remembered how her mother used to say, "When you play, play like the world is listening." Her trembling fingers found their place on the keys. And then she pressed the first note. It was soft, deep, and full of life. The sound filled the empty space and settled over the room like a calm wave. She began to play slowly, each note flowing into the next like a story being told without words. The melody wasn't one anyone recognized. It wasn't from a famous composer or a book. It was hers. Her hands moved with a mix of grace and raw emotion. She didn't look at the audience or the director. She closed her eyes and let the music guide her. Her body swayed gently, and for a moment the world outside the piano disappeared. The whispers stopped. The rustling of papers stopped. Even the director, who had been leaning back with a disinterested expression, slowly sat up straight. Something about her playing was different. The melody was simple but powerful. It carried sadness, love, and hope all at once. Each note seemed to tell a part of her life, the loneliness, the struggle, the dreams that kept her awake. When she reached the middle of her piece, her touch became lighter, almost like a whisper. Then the music grew again, stronger and brighter, like sunlight breaking through clouds. By the time she played the final note, the entire hall was silent. She lifted her hands from the keys and sat there for a moment, unsure what to do. Her breathing was unsteady, Slowly, she turned toward the judges. The woman beside the director had her hand over her mouth. One of the other judges was staring at the piano, lost in thought. The director didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his face unreadable. The silence stretched for a few seconds more until the director finally spoke. His voice was calm but low. "What was that piece you played?" She looked down. "It's something I wrote myself. You composed it?" "Yes, sir. I never learned to read notes properly. I just play what I feel." The director blinked. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. He had judged hundreds of students, all technically skilled, trained by the best, but this was different. This was real. He looked at her again, the same girl he had almost dismissed. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You may go now." The girl stood, bowed again, and walked off the stage. She didn't know what her performance meant to them. She didn't expect applause. She didn't even think she would be chosen. But as she stepped out of the hall, a strange feeling of peace washed over her. For the first time, she felt like she had truly shared a part of herself with the world. Behind her, the director sat still. He was staring at the piano, lost in thought. One of the judges turned to him and said softly, "You saw that too, didn't you?" He nodded slowly, not taking his eyes off the stage. "Yes," he whispered. "That wasn't just playing. That was something else." The girl walked outside into the open air. The city was loud and busy, but she didn't hear it. She sat on the steps for a while, her hands still tingling from the keys. She didn't know what the future held, whether she'd be accepted or forgotten. But deep inside, she knew one thing for sure. She had given it her all. As she looked up at the wide blue sky, a faint smile appeared on her face. The same hands that once played on a broken keyboard in a small town had just filled a grand hall with music. Whatever happened next, she had already won something far more important: the courage to be heard. When the girl stepped out of the audition hall, the sound of her own heartbeat was louder than the city noise outside. She sat on the cold steps, holding her old music folder close to her chest. The performance still echoed in her mind. Every note, every pause, every breath she had taken on that stage. For a long time, she stayed there, unsure what to feel. She didn't know whether she had impressed the judges or just confused them. She only knew she had given them a piece of her soul through that piano. People walked past her, some smiling, some carrying their instruments proudly. She could hear bits of conversation, excitement, relief, disappointment. A group of students laughed nearby, talking about how strict the director was. One of them mentioned his name with fear and admiration. "He doesn't like mistakes," one of them said. "He only chooses perfection." The girl looked down at her hands and smiled sadly. Her playing wasn't perfect. It never had been. It was just real. After a while, she stood up and began walking toward the bus stop. The streets were busy with cars and vendors calling out to customers. She could smell roasted corn from a nearby stall, and her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since morning, but she didn't have enough money to buy anything. She only had enough for her ticket home. At the bus stop, she sat quietly, thinking about her mother's words. "If your heart believes in your music, one day someone else will too." She closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself, "I did my best." When the bus arrived, she climbed aboard, found a seat by the window, and watched the city fade behind her. The sound of the engine mixed with her thoughts. The image of the director's expression kept returning, the way he had looked at her after she played the last note. She couldn't tell if it meant approval or confusion, but something in his eyes had changed, and that was enough to keep a small spark of hope alive. Back in her hometown, life returned to its quiet rhythm. She went back to helping at the small shop near her house during the day and played piano at the old church in the evenings. The church's piano was old and had several broken keys, but she made it work. Children from the neighborhood often came to listen. They didn't understand much about music, but they liked the way it made them feel. One evening, while she was practicing alone, the local postman stopped by the church. He waved a small envelope in the air. "There's something for you," he said, smiling. "Looks official." Her hands froze midair. She wiped them quickly on her dress and took the letter. It had the seal of the Music Academy. Her heart jumped. She stood there staring at it for a few seconds, afraid to open it. "Go on," the postman said, chuckling. "You'll never know if you don't open it." With shaking fingers, she tore the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter. Her eyes moved quickly over the words, her breath catching at every line. Then she stopped and covered her mouth in shock. She had been accepted. The HOA letter said she had passed the first round of auditions and was invited to return to the academy for the next stage, a live performance, in front of an audience and the full board of judges. It also mentioned that her playing had deep emotional quality and originality. Her knees felt weak. For a moment she couldn't even speak. Then she let out a small laugh, one that sounded half like a sob. "I did it," she whispered. "I really did it." The postman clapped his hands and smiled. "I don't know what it means, but it sounds like good news." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "It's the best news I've ever had." That night she could hardly sleep. She kept reading the letter again and again, afraid that if she stopped, the words would disappear. The next morning, she went to the church early and started practicing. She wanted her next performance to be better, fuller, more confident. She played until her fingers ached, but she didn't stop. Days passed quickly. When the time came, she took the same long bus ride back to the city, this time with her heart filled with both fear and excitement. As she walked toward the academy gates, the memories of her first audition came rushing back. The laughter, the doubt, the heavy silence after her final note. Inside, the hall looked the same, but everything felt different. There were more people this time, students, teachers, guests, and even some media cameras. The academy called it an open performance, where the most promising candidates from the auditions would play again in front of an audience. When she entered, some of the other performers recognized her from before. A few of them whispered, surprised that she had made it this far. One boy smirked and said, "Maybe she got lucky." She heard him but said nothing. She waited quietly backstage as one performer after another went up to play. The music was stunning. Flawless performances of famous pieces filled with technique and power. She listened, admiring them but also feeling a knot in her stomach. Her style was different. She didn't play to impress. She played to feel. Would they understand that? When her name was finally called, she walked to the stage with slow, steady steps. The bright lights blinded her for a moment. The hall was full this time, rows and rows of faces watching her. The director sat in the front row, his expression serious as ever. She bowed politely, then sat at the piano. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling just a little. She took a deep breath and started to play. This time, she didn't play the same piece as before. She chose something new, another song she had written herself, one filled with warmth and hope. The melody began softly like a whisper, then grew into something gentle and uplifting. Her music wrapped around the audience like sunlight. It wasn't loud or grand. It was honest and pure. People who had been talking fell silent. Even the children in the audience stopped moving. The director leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on her hands. Halfway through, she felt her nervousness fade. She wasn't performing anymore, she was sharing. The piano wasn't just an instrument. It was her voice. When she finished, the sound of her last note lingered in the air. Then came the silence. That same deep silence she remembered from before. The director's eyes were on her again, unreadable, but intense. Then slowly, people began to clap. It started softly, then grew until the hall was filled with applause. She stood up and bowed, her eyes glistening. She didn't expect such a reaction. She looked at the director one last time, hoping to read something on his face. He didn't smile, but he nodded, a small, firm nod that meant more than any words. As she walked off the stage, she felt light, almost weightless. Backstage, some of the same students who had ignored her before looked at her differently now. One of them whispered, "She's really good." The director spoke briefly to the judges, then looked toward the stage door where she had exited. There was a thoughtful look in his eyes, something like regret or admiration, or maybe both. That evening, the girl walked back to her small rented room near the bus station. She sat by the window listening to the faint sounds of the city. Her heart was full not just of hope but of peace. Whatever the final decision would be, she knew she had already done something important. She had made them listen. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her music was meant for something bigger. The night after her performance, the girl lay awake in her small room staring at the ceiling. The applause from the audience still echoed in her ears. It didn't feel real. For so long she had dreamed of being heard, of someone truly listening to her music, and now it had finally happened. The letter of acceptance had been pinned to the wall above her bed. She looked at it every night before sleeping. It was her reminder that all those years of struggle had not been for nothing. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. The final results of the performance would be announced in a week. The girl tried not to think about it, but every day felt like forever. She practiced in her room using a small second-hand keyboard she had bought from a local shop. It didn't sound anything like the grand piano at the academy, but it was all she had. Each morning she would play the same melodies again and again, not to impress anyone this time, but to feel calm. Her fingers moved over the keys gently as if she was talking to an old friend. Days passed and the tension grew. On the 7th day she received another letter. Her hands shook as she opened it. For a moment she just stood there staring at the first line. Then tears filled her eyes. She had been selected as one of the academy's new students. Her heart raced as she read further. She would receive a scholarship to study piano for the next 2 years. It was everything she had dreamed of but never dared to expect. She pressed the letter to her chest, crying softly, whispering, "Thank you, thank you." When she returned to the city, she carried only a small suitcase and her old music folder. The academy looked even bigger than she remembered. Students rushed across the courtyard talking about upcoming concerts and lessons. She felt small among them, but she reminded herself that she had earned her place. On the first day, the new students were gathered in the auditorium. The director stood on stage, addressing them with his usual stern tone. "Talent," he said, "is not enough. Discipline, emotion, and dedication. These are what turn a musician into an artist." His eyes scanned the room and stopped briefly when they met hers. She felt her heart skip. He didn't say her name, but that short glance was enough to make her feel noticed. Classes began soon after. The lessons were intense. Long hours of theory, practice, and evaluation. Most students had years of training behind them, while she had none. Reading sheet music was still difficult for her. She struggled to keep up with the rest, often staying late in the practice room after everyone else had gone home. Sometimes other students whispered about her. "She's the one who got in without training," they said. "Just wait until the real tests start." She heard them, but she didn't answer. Instead, she practiced harder. Every evening, when the academy halls were empty, she sat alone at the piano playing until her fingers hurt. One night, while she was practicing, the door creaked open. She turned quickly and saw the director standing there. He didn't speak at first. He just watched as she played. She stopped and stood up quickly, nervous and unsure what to say. "Why did you stop?" he asked, walking closer. "I thought you might need the room," she replied quietly. He shook his head. "Continue. I want to hear what you were playing." She sat again, hands trembling slightly, and began to play one of her own melodies. Soft, delicate, filled with emotion. The director stood by the piano, arms crossed, listening intently. When she finished, he nodded slowly. "You play with heart," he said, "but you still lack structure. You must learn control, not to cage your feelings, but to shape them." She looked up at him, unsure what to say. His voice wasn't mocking this time. It was calm, almost encouraging. "I understand," she said softly. He pointed at the piano. "I'll be watching your progress. Don't waste what you have." Then he turned and left, leaving her stunned. From that day on, something changed in her. She practiced even harder, studying every bit of music theory she could find. Slowly, she began to understand how to blend her natural emotion with technical skill. The music she played started to sound fuller, more controlled, yet still full of life. Weeks passed, and one morning the director announced that there would be a mid-year concert. Each student would perform in front of the academy staff and guests. It was a chance to prove themselves. The girl's heart pounded when she heard the news. This was her chance, not just to play again, but to show how much she had grown. She spent every free moment preparing. She rewrote her composition, blending her own style with new techniques she had learned. Some nights she stayed awake past midnight, whispering the melody to herself as she practiced on the silent keys. On the day of the concert, the auditorium was packed. Teachers, students, and guests filled the seats. The girl waited backstage, her hands cold and shaky. She could hear the other students performing, fast, confident, flawless. When her turn came, she walked out slowly, trying to steady her breathing. The director sat among the judges again, expression serious but calm. She sat at the piano, closed her eyes for a brief moment, and began to play. This time her fingers moved with confidence. Her melody started softly, telling a story of struggle and hope. Then it grew, stronger and brighter, as if she was sharing every moment of pain and every bit of joy she had ever felt. The audience leaned in. The music wasn't perfect. A few notes trembled, but it was alive. It spoke directly to their hearts. When she played the final note, the silence that followed was deep and powerful. Then came the applause, not polite or gentle, but thunderous. The girl looked up and saw the director standing. He was clapping too, something he rarely did. Their eyes met, and for the first time she saw a small smile on his face. After the concert, he approached her backstage. "You did well," he said simply. "You've learned to shape your music without losing its soul." She smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir. I only played what I feel." He nodded. "That's why it works." As he walked away, she stood there, feeling something she had never felt before, acceptance. Not just from him, but from herself. That night when she returned to her room, she sat by the window with her eyes closed. The city lights sparkled outside, and in her heart she felt calm. The road ahead was still long, but she was no longer afraid. The same girl who once played on a broken keyboard in a small town had now earned a place among the city's finest. And though she didn't know what the future held, one thing was clear. Her journey had only just begun. Weeks passed since the mid-year concert, and the girl's life at the academy had settled into a new rhythm. The early nerves had faded, replaced by a steady focus. She woke each morning before sunrise, practicing on the grand piano in the empty hall. The sounds of her own playing were the first thing she heard each day, filling her tiny rented room with warmth and comfort. Despite the long hours and hard work, she never felt alone. Even when other students whispered about her or doubted her abilities, she kept moving forward. They didn't understand how much she had sacrificed to get here. The nights without sleep, the broken instruments, the moments when she had almost given up. She carried those experiences with her, letting them guide each note she played. One morning, the director called her to his office. Her stomach sank with nerves as she walked through the hallways, clutching her music folder tightly. She had no idea what this could mean. Was she in trouble? Had she made a mistake? When she entered, the director was sitting at his desk, papers spread around him. He looked up and nodded at her. "Sit down," he said. She obeyed, hands folded in her lap. His eyes, sharp as ever, studied her quietly for a moment. "You've improved since the last performance," he said. "Your technique is stronger, your music more controlled. But there is still something missing." She swallowed hard. "What do you mean, sir?" He leaned back in his chair. "Emotion alone is not enough. You must learn to balance it with understanding. You must know not only what you feel, but also how to shape it so that others feel it too. That is the mark of a true musician." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. Though they were challenging, they didn't discourage her. Instead, they made her want to work harder. The next few weeks were some of the most intense of her life. Every lesson, every practice session was filled with focus and purpose. She studied music theory, practiced scales she had never imagined she could play, and experimented with dynamics and tempo. Some nights she felt exhausted and frustrated, but she refused to stop. She remembered her mother's voice, whispering encouragement after long days. "Keep going. One day they will hear your heart." One afternoon, the academy announced an upcoming recital. It would be held at a famous concert hall, and every student was expected to perform. For the first time, the girl felt a flutter of fear. The hall was enormous, and the audience would be full of experts and music lovers. It was a bigger stage than she had ever played on. Still, she knew this was her chance to prove herself. She chose one of her own compositions, a piece she had been shaping for weeks. It was filled with the joy, struggle, and hope she carried in her heart. She practiced tirelessly, each day adding new layers, refining every passage, making the music speak as clearly as she could. The day of the recital arrived. The hall was magnificent, the polished wood floors gleaming, the chandeliers hanging high above, and the audience filling every seat. The girl waited backstage, trying to calm the storm of nerves in her chest. She could hear the applause for the performers before her, each one receiving praise and admiration. She was next. When her name was called, she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, and the audience was larger than any she had seen. Her heart raced, but she held her head high. The director sat in the front row watching quietly, as he had during all her performances. She sat at the grand piano, took a deep breath, and let her hands find the keys. The first notes rang out clear and steady, filling the vast hall. The melody began softly, delicate and tender like a story being whispered. Then it grew, carrying strength, warmth, and hope. Every note told her journey, her struggles, her quiet victories, her belief that music could touch hearts. As she played, the audience fell silent. The director leaned forward slightly, his face thoughtful. This time she felt no need to impress him. She played for herself, for the music, and for every person who had ever believed in her when no one else did. Halfway through, the girl's confidence surged. She allowed herself to be fully immersed in the music, letting the story flow naturally. Her fingers moved with precision and grace, each note shaped and intentional. The hall seemed to hold its breath with her, every listener caught in the moment. When she finished, the final note lingered in the air, delicate and perfect. Then, as if a dam had broken, the audience erupted in applause. It started softly, then grew louder and louder, filling the hall with thunderous appreciation. She stood bowing humbly, tears welling in her eyes. The director rose to his feet as well, clapping with quiet admiration. It was rare for him to show emotion so openly. When their eyes met, he nodded, a gesture full of recognition and respect. After the recital, she was approached by several teachers and staff members. "You've grown so much," one of them said. "Your music has depth and power now. You're extraordinary." She smiled shyly, feeling a warmth that went beyond words. For the first time, she realized that she wasn't just a student who had been accepted despite her lack of training. She was now a musician in her own right. Later that evening, she walked alone through the quiet streets of the city, her heart still racing from the performance. She thought about how far she had come, from practicing on a broken keyboard in a small town to performing in one of the city's grandest halls. It felt surreal. She paused on a bridge overlooking the river, watching the lights reflect on the water. She let herself think about her mother and all the sacrifices she had made. She whispered softly, "I did it, Mom. I'm doing it." That night, as she returned to her small room, she realized something important. Talent alone was not enough. Hard work, perseverance, and belief in oneself were what truly mattered. The journey had been long, and there were still challenges ahead, but she was ready to face them. The next morning, the director called her again. This time he had a different tone, quieter, almost thoughtful. "You've proven something," he said. "Not to me, not to the academy, but to yourself. Never lose that." She nodded, feeling a surge of pride. She had never sought validation from others, but now she understood that recognition was not just about approval. It was about knowing that her music mattered, that her voice could be heard. In the following weeks, her confidence grew. She helped other students with techniques she had mastered, sharing her insights without pride. Slowly, she became known not just for her talent, but for her kindness and dedication. Even some of the students who had doubted her began to approach her, asking for advice and guidance. She always responded with patience, remembering how it felt to be uncertain, to be dismissed, to wonder if she truly belonged. One evening, after a long day of practice, she sat alone at the piano in the academy's hall. She played a quiet, reflective piece she had composed just for herself. The notes floated gently, a mixture of joy and sorrow, triumph and humility. She closed her eyes, feeling the music fill every corner of her being. For the first time, she understood the true power of music. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about connection, with oneself, with others, and with the moments that made life worth living. And she knew that she was only beginning. The day of the Academy's annual grand concert had finally arrived. The girl woke before sunrise, her body filled with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Months of practice, sacrifice, and struggle had led to this moment. She had grown stronger, more confident, and more determined than ever, but the weight of the occasion pressed on her chest. She dressed simply, her plain clothes now carrying the quiet elegance of someone who had worked hard for this moment. She carried her music folder like a treasure and walked toward the concert hall with steady steps. The streets of the city were quiet in the early morning, and for the first time in weeks she felt a strange calm wash over her. Inside the hall, the atmosphere buzzed with anticipation. Students, teachers, and guests filled every seat, the air thick with expectation. The grand piano gleamed under the lights on the polished stage, waiting for her. She looked at it and took a deep breath, imagining herself at the small broken keyboard in her hometown. The memory made her smile. Backstage, students prepared nervously, practicing final notes and adjusting their posture. Some glanced at her and whispered, recognizing her as the girl who had once been underestimated but had now become one of the Academy's brightest talents. She paid them no attention, focusing instead on her breathing, letting her hands rest gently in her lap. The director appeared at the side of the stage, his usual stern expression softened by something she had never seen before, a hint of pride. He gave her a small nod and she returned it, understanding that he believed in her. That small gesture filled her with confidence. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, but she no longer feared them. She sat at the piano and allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her hands hovered above the keys, trembling slightly, but she welcomed it. This trembling wasn't fear. It was energy, a sign that she was alive, ready to share everything she had learned. The first note sounded. It was clear, full, and strong. The hall fell silent. The girl's fingers danced over the keys, carrying a melody she had written herself, one that spoke of hope, struggle, love, and the courage to keep moving forward. Each note was deliberate yet fluid, precise yet alive with emotion. She played with everything she had. She thought of her mother, of the nights spent practicing alone, of the broken keyboards in quiet towns. She thought of every moment that had brought her here. Her music was no longer just a reflection of her feelings. It was a story, a bridge between her past and the present, a message to everyone listening. The audience leaned forward, captivated. They were drawn not by technique alone, but by the honesty and depth of her music. Some closed their eyes, letting the melody reach deep inside them. Others sat motionless, completely absorbed. And in the front row, the director watched quietly, his face calm but full of appreciation. Halfway through the piece, her confidence soared. She let herself feel the music completely, allowing each note to flow naturally. There was no doubt in her mind. The melody rose and fell, soft and powerful in turns, carrying the audience along with her. She no longer played to prove herself. She played because it was who she was. As she reached the final part of the composition, the music became gentle again, reflective and tender. Every note lingered, painting pictures of her journey, the moments of loneliness, the victories, the fears she had overcome, and the dreams that had kept her going. When she played the final note, it hung in the air, delicate and perfect. Silence enveloped the hall for a few moments, as if everyone was holding their breath, savoring the last echo of her melody. Then the audience erupted into applause, cheers, and whistles. The sound was overwhelming, filling the hall like a storm of admiration and emotion. Tears filled her eyes as she stood and bowed. The applause was no longer just for her talent, but for her journey, her courage, and the story she had shared. She looked toward the director, and for the first time he smiled, fully, without reservation. It was a smile that spoke of recognition, respect, and pride. After the performance, she stepped backstage. Students and teachers approached her, clapping and congratulating her. Some of the same students who had doubted her now looked at her with admiration. "That was incredible," one of them said softly. "I didn't know music could feel like that." She smiled, feeling warmth spread through her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I only played what I felt." The director appeared behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You've done something remarkable," he said, his voice calm and sincere. "I once doubted you, but now I see that talent isn't always about training. It's about heart, perseverance, and the courage to be yourself. You've shown all of that today." She looked up at him, speechless for a moment. Then she nodded, understanding that this acknowledgement was far more meaningful than any award or recognition. Later that evening, she walked alone through the quiet streets of the city, her hands still tingling from the performance. She thought about how far she had come, from practicing on a broken keyboard in a small town to performing on a grand stage before an audience of hundreds. She had faced doubt, mockery, and fear, but she had never given up. She paused on a bridge overlooking the river, the city lights shimmering on the water. She let herself breathe deeply, feeling a sense of peace she had never known. The journey had been long, and there would still be challenges ahead, but she now knew something important. She could overcome them. That night, she returned to her small room, sat by the window, and played a quiet melody on her keyboard. It wasn't meant for an audience. It was just for her. The notes floated gently, carrying the emotions of the day: joy, relief, pride, and gratitude. She smiled softly, closing her eyes as she played. In the days that followed, life at the academy continued. She was no longer the timid girl who had walked through the doors months ago. She had earned respect, not through arrogance or defiance, but through dedication, honesty, and heart. Students and teachers alike looked to her as an example, not just for her skill, but for her courage and resilience. Even the director, who had once mocked her abilities, now treated her differently. He challenged her, pushed her, and encouraged her, but always with respect. He would occasionally watch her practice silently, a thoughtful expression on his face, as if reminding himself that talent sometimes came from the most unexpected places. One evening, after another long day of lessons and practice, she sat at the grand piano in the empty hall. She reflected on her journey, thinking about all the people who had doubted her, all the struggles she had faced, and all the moments that had shaped her. She realized that every hardship had been a lesson. Every setback had been a push toward growth, and every doubt had been an opportunity to prove herself. Her music filled the empty hall, soft and gentle at first, then rising with strength and hope. She played for herself, for the past and for the future, and in that moment she understood something powerful. Music was more than notes and technique. It was life itself, expressed through emotion, perseverance, and heart. Months later, the girl performed again at a national event. The audience was larger, the stage grander, but she no longer felt fear. She walked onto the stage with confidence, sat at the piano, and let her hands tell her story. The same journey that had once been mocked now moved hearts and inspired others. After the performance, the director approached her, a rare smile on his face. "I once underestimated you," he said softly, "but now I see that you are a true artist. Keep playing, and never stop sharing your heart with the world." The girl nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I will," she whispered. "Thank you for believing in me." She walked off the stage that night, no longer the girl who had been doubted and dismissed. She was a musician, a storyteller, and a dreamer who had fought for every note she played. The applause, the recognition, and the respect were not what defined her. It was the courage to keep playing, to keep believing, and to never give up on her dreams. And as she looked ahead to the future, she knew that her music would continue to touch lives, inspire others, and remind the world that talent, heart, and perseverance could overcome any obstacle. Her journey had begun with a single note, and now, she was ready to fill the world with many more. After months of training, performing, and learning, the girl felt a new kind of confidence growing inside her. The academy had become her second home. Each day brought challenges, but she no longer feared them. Instead, she saw them as chances to grow, to test her limits, and to understand more about herself. One morning, she arrived at the academy early, long before classes began. The hallways were quiet, and the sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the polished floors. She carried her music folder and a small notebook, where she wrote her ideas for new melodies. Sitting at the grand piano in the practice room, she began to play. The notes flowed easily, naturally, as if they were part of her very being. She experimented with rhythms, tried new combinations, and let her emotions guide her. Every mistake she made was a lesson, every success a small victory. It wasn't long before other students arrived. Some of them peeked through the door, curious. A few came in to watch, but she didn't mind. She had learned long ago that music wasn't about showing off. It was about expressing what was inside. One of the teachers came in quietly. He stood behind her, listening without interrupting. When she finished the piece she had been practicing, he clapped softly. "You have grown so much," he said. "There's a maturity in your music now. People can feel every note you play." She smiled a little shyly. "Thank you, sir. I just play what I feel." The teacher nodded. "And that is why it matters. Never forget that." Later that week, the academy announced an opportunity to perform at a citywide music festival. Students would be chosen to represent the academy on a public stage. The girl's heart jumped when she heard the news. This was bigger than anything she had done before. She knew it would be intimidating. The audience would be much larger, and the stage was unfamiliar. But she also knew she had grown. She had practiced, learned, and performed countless times. She could face this challenge. Over the next few days, she focused entirely on preparation. She rewrote one of her original pieces, refining it and adding layers of emotion she had learned to control. Every day she practiced for hours, sometimes late into the night. She pushed herself, but she also listened, to her heart, to the piano, and to the feelings she wanted to share with the world. The day of the festival arrived. The city was alive with excitement. Streets were filled with people, banners waved in the wind, and music from various performers echoed in the distance. She felt a mix of nervousness and anticipation as she walked toward the stage area with the academy staff and fellow students. Backstage, she found a quiet corner and closed her eyes. She thought about everything that had brought her here. The nights of practice in her small town, the broken keyboard, her mother's encouragement, the first audition, the mockery, and finally the recognition. All of it had led to this moment. When it was her turn, she walked onto the stage. The lights were bright, the audience vast. Her heart raced, but she took a deep breath and reminded herself of one simple truth. She played not for fame, not for approval, but because music was her voice. She sat at the grand piano and let her fingers hover over the keys. The first note rang out, strong and clear. The hall went quiet. She began to play her melody, soft at first, then growing with emotion and strength. Each note carried a piece of her journey, from struggle to triumph, from doubt to hope. The audience listened in silence. Some closed their eyes, letting the music touch them. Some held their breath, completely absorbed. And in the front row, the director watched with pride. The girl had once been underestimated, but now he saw the full measure of her talent and heart. As she continued, she lost herself in the music. Her fingers moved with grace and confidence, shaping each note as she intended. She remembered all the lessons, all the guidance, all the hard work. Every note was a reflection of who she had become. When she reached the final chord, she let it linger, soft and pure. The silence was profound, a moment where every listener felt the story she had shared. Then slowly, applause began. It started softly but grew louder, filling the hall. The audience cheered, clapped, and some even rose to their feet. Tears came to her eyes as she stood and bowed. This time she felt something deeper than happiness or pride. She felt gratitude for the journey, for the people who had believed in her, and for herself for never giving up. After the performance, the director approached her again. "You've become more than I imagined," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Your music moves people, not just because of skill, but because of heart. Remember this feeling and carry it forward." She nodded, overwhelmed with emotion. "I will, sir." I promise. The festival organizers came forward, praising her performance. Local musicians and teachers approached her, expressing admiration for the depth and beauty of her music. She smiled, humbled by their words, knowing that all of it was the result of persistence, courage, and love for what she did. That evening, she walked back to her small room, the city lights sparkling around her. She played a quiet piece on her keyboard, not for anyone else, but for herself. Each note was a reminder of how far she had come, and a promise of what she could still achieve. The girl knew the road ahead would not always be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, and more obstacles to overcome, but she also knew she had the strength to face them. She had learned that talent alone was never enough. It was heart, determination, and resilience that made the difference. In the quiet of her room, she thought about the people who had shaped her journey. Her mother, whose gentle encouragement had never wavered, the teachers who had guided her, the director who had once doubted her and now respected her. Each had played a part in her growth. Most of all, she thought about herself, the small girl who had walked into an audition, trembling and unsure, and had dared to play. She had not only been heard, but she had also touched hearts and inspired others. That thought filled her with quiet pride. As she lay down to sleep that night, she whispered softly to herself, "I will keep playing. I will keep sharing my heart." And she knew it was true. Music was no longer just something she did. It was who she was. The next morning, she awoke with a sense of purpose. Each day at the academy, each note she played, each piece she wrote or performed was part of a larger journey. She knew that her music could inspire, heal, and connect people. She had seen it happen with her own performances, and she felt ready to continue that path. She stepped out into the city, her music folder in hand, a quiet smile on her face. The world was full of challenges and opportunities alike, and she was ready for both. The girl who had once been mocked, doubted, and underestimated had found her voice. She had turned every struggle into strength and every note into a story. And as the morning sun bathed the streets in light, she felt a deep certainty. Her music would carry her forward not just to greater performances, but to a life filled with passion, meaning, and the power to touch the hearts of everyone who listened. She walked toward the academy, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that her journey was far from over, but that she had already proven that courage, heart, and dedication could overcome any obstacle. And with that thought, she smiled, feeling the music inside her rise and flow as endless and bright as the day ahead.